Lord Butler, Robin, I'm delighted that you've agreed to come along and have a conversation on Lord Speaker's podcast.
I feel very honoured, John. Thank you.
You've had a distinguished career, Harrow and Oxford, and I think you went into the civil service straight away, and you'd been in the civil service for 37 years, retiring in 1998. You've been private secretary to a number of prime ministers, including Edward Heath, and you've also been cabinet secretary. So just to get a flavour of that from you, I think would be important. For example, why did you choose the civil service when you had a range of opportunities coming out of Oxford?
Well, my father, who was a great influence on me, wanted me to be a lawyer. And I was a sort of third generation. My grandfather had started a paint company. My father married into it. And by that time, it was rather crowded. And so anyway, it was sort of third generation. And I think third generation, your parents like you to go into the professions. So he took me along to the law courts. And he took me into a case where there was a barrister cross-examining a woman in a contested divorce case. And it shocked me because he was doing a very professional job, very courteous, but it was her life he was taking to bits. And I felt I can't do that. And especially in those days, there was still capital punishment. I imagined myself cross-examining somebody for their life. So I didn't do that. Now, what attracted me to the civil service? Well, I was an idealist young man. I wanted to do something in public service. And I'm sorry to say I was also a competitive young man.
Now, you like sport?
I like sport. And the civil service had a competitive exam. And so I thought, well...
But you came first?
I came first, yeah. And I don't quite know how.
There you are. And 37 years later. And you came into the House of Lords in 1998, I believe.
When I retired as Cabinet Secretary.
As you know, politics is in flux. It's always in flux, politics, not any different. But the issue at the moment is change with a new government coming in. And you have seen change. And if I'm correct, that you were private secretary to Edward Heath to begin with. I think in one of your interviews, you said you had a real affection for Edward Heath. Why was that?
I thought that he was a serious man. He was very reserved. He didn't have many social graces, but he was also a kind man. And he'd lived through the war. He was a one-nation politician. And, of course, he had the ideal of getting Britain into Europe, which he succeeded in doing. And I think he had the vision during times that were difficult for industrial relations that Britain would thrive economically if government, business and the trade unions worked together. Mm-hmm. That's what he was aiming to achieve. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a good objective.
He had an incomes policy, didn't he?
Had an incomes policy and a prices policy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the end, he couldn't get the cooperation of the NUM. Yeah. Yeah. He had a good relationship with the NUM General Secretary, Joe Gormley, mm-hmm. but the executive, which included Arthur Scargill and Mick Magahi, they were determined to not to accept. And so in the end, the NUM strike went ahead, and the coal was running out at the power stations. Mm-hmm. And so really, Heath was driven into an election which he didn't want.
Is it the case that both Edward Heath and Harold Wilson, regarding Europe, showed exceptional skills?
Yes, they did, but Harold Wilson perhaps particularly, because of course, you'll recall, the Labour Party was divided over Europe.
Very familiar.
Yeah. Harold Wilson, there was a pledge that they would renegotiate the terms. That was what Harold Wilson offered to the party. And he kept his cards very close to his chest so that people really didn't know whether he was in favour of staying in Europe or leaving. He was, in fact, in favour of staying. And I always remember when they were getting to the end of the renegotiation of terms, he had entertained Helmut Schmidt at Chequers the weekend before. None of us were present. There were no private secretaries. They talked privately. And I'm sure that he agreed with Helmut Schmidt, the deal that Helmut Schmidt was prepared to give Britain. And that was on the weekend before. During the week, there was a cabinet meeting. And there were the skeptics in the cabinet, Tony Blair, Varley, Peter Shaw. And Harold Wilson said to the cabinet, this is my red line. If I can get these, I will recommend that people stay. But if I can't get these, I shall recommend that in the referendum that Britain leaves. And they seem very ambitious terms. And so
you think perhaps preparatory work had been done beforehand?
He'd fixed it with
exactly.
Helmut Schmidt. And as it happened, I was the private secretary on duty that weekend. And on I think it must have been the Friday night, Harold Wilson was making a speech to the Society of London Labour Mayors. And he said at this speech, if I can get these terms, I will recommend that Britain stays in. And suddenly, the Euroscepticism cabinet saw the trap that was opening up, and I was on duty, and they rang me up and said, who authorised the Prime Minister to say this? And I said, well, if you look at the cabinet minutes, you'll see that he said that if he couldn't get these terms, he'd recommend we leave, and the opposite is also true. And of course, he did get the terms, recommended that Britain voted yes in the referendum, and the referendum was won by 2/3 to 1/3.
Yeah, and you were cabinet secretary when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. You'd experience of many things, relationship with the trade unions, the change there, the Brighton bomb as a result of that. Give us a flavour of your time and your personal engagement with Margaret Thatcher.
Well, just to say that, I had the great privilege of working very closely, seeing very close to hand 5 prime ministers. Mm-hmm. And I admired them all. They all had different qualities, but there wasn't, whatever the media might suggest, there wasn't one of them who's a knave or a fool. Margaret Thatcher was the most demanding, by this, that she didn't care what time she went to bed. So, you sat up long into the night. And when she had a big speech coming up, those were terrible times because, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, you'd sit there and she was arguing whether would should be could or and should be but until you wanted to die. But she was very demanding. On the other hand, her great advantage was you didn't have to ask her what she thought. That was...
So the message had clarity.
Clarity, but also steadfastness. Mm-hmm. And for somebody like me working for her, if she thought that you were doing your best for her, she would always stand by you. It wasn't true of some of her cabinet colleagues, but certainly for us, her staff. You knew where you were with her.
In Brighton at the time, am I correct in saying that her demands led you to being in her room at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and you feel that had you not had that meeting, she could have been a victim? Oh,
there's no doubt of it.
Because she moved.
She'd finished her speech unusually early for the pre-conference speech. I was there not for the politics, but because there was always number 10 business to be done. And I also did some checking on the facts in the speech. And she'd finished the speech writers had gone, and there was a piece of paper on which the number 10 office wanted a decision by the next morning. So I said to her, would you look at this overnight and let me know at breakfast what your decision is? And she said, if you don't mind, I'll do it now, and then I can forget about it and concentrate on thinking about the speech. So she was sitting in her chair in her sitting room, looking at this piece of paper. I was at a chair sitting like I'm sitting with you now, looking forward to getting to bed, and then there was suddenly this mighty explosion. And I'd heard bombs before, so I knew it was a bomb. I suddenly came to, and I thought, you're alone with the Prime Minister, somebody's trying to blow her up, you better do something sensible. So I said to her, I think you should come away from the windows in case there's another bomb. She didn't hesitate for a moment. She said, I must see if Dennis is all right. Mm-hmm. So she goes to the bedroom, opens the door, bedroom in darkness, and you could hear the sounds of falling masonry through, because it was the bathroom that was collapsing. Mm-hmm. And I should have said, stand back, Prime Minister, this is a job for somebody more dispensable than you, but so, you know, I had my inhibitions, so she went in, and a moment or two later she came out with Dennis pulling his grey flannel trousers over his pyjamas, and we went out into the corridor, and we looked up the corridor, and amazingly the lights had stayed on despite this huge explosion in the hotel. And when we looked up, the next suite along, we saw what looked like smoke coming out from under the door, and that was the suite that Geoffrey Howe had. So I thought the bomb must have been in there, and again, I'll never forget it. His security man was running at the door, trying to kick it in, so that, and luckily he failed, because there'd have been a void the other side of the door. And Geoffrey came out from the next room along, which was their bedroom, and came down, and while we were standing there, a fireman appeared, because it was a very quick response. And the fireman said, follow me. So we fell and followed him down the corridor. As I say, the lights were still on. The corridor was a cul-de-sac. So he said, follow me back. So we followed him back, went down the main stairs of the hotel, and we thought maybe the bomb had been at the reception desk, and Margaret Thatcher broke off and went to see whether the people behind the reception desk were okay, which they were. And then we were taken out of the back, and then we were taken, or Margaret Thatcher was taken off to Hove Police Station. I, remembering, that all the number 10 papers had been left about, our clothes were all still up there, with one of her protection officers, I went back up, not realizing that the hotel was hanging by a thread above my head, and packed everything up and came down, and then went on and joined them at the police station.
So it was fortuitous that she had that meeting with you in the bedroom at that time?
Well, I think so. I mean, certainly if she'd gone to the bathroom, she'd have suffered something. I mean, I don't know whether it would have been fatal. But yes, I mean, it was...
Did you try and dissuade her from speaking to the conference early the next morning?
I did. We were taken off to Lewis Police Training College, and she was given a room, and I kept down in the day room where there was a television and a telephone. And John Gummer rang up at about 5:30, I suppose, and said, it's much worse than we thought. There are already fatalities, and they're digging for John Wakeham and for Norman Tebbit in the wreckage of the hotel. And he said, television's here, so I turned on the television and watched what was happening and saw Norman Tebbit being brought out, badly injured. And they still hadn't found John Wakeham. Anyway, I thought, well, shall I wake up Margaret Thatcher and tell her? And then I thought, no, I mean, best she gets some sleep. So at 8 o'clock, she appears. I'd rescued her clothes, so she was in her day clothes. And I said, Prime Minister, I'm afraid it's bad, and we lost 5 people. John Wakeham still not brought out. Norman Tebbit badly injured. She didn't hesitate for a moment. She said, well, the conference is due to begin at 9:30, and we must make sure it begins on time. And I was appalled. I said to her, there's terrible things happen. Some of your closest colleagues have been killed and badly injured. You can't be going on with a party conference. And she said, this is our opportunity to show that terrorism can't defeat democracy. And of course, she was right and I was wrong. And that's what she did demonstrate. And at 9:30, there she was on the platform saying, we are shaken but not daunted.
Have you ever contradicted a cabinet minister or a prime minister and had your way?
Well, I certainly advised them not to do things. I mean, with Margaret Thatcher, she never yielded an inch when you advised her about something. However, next time the subject came up, you often found that she'd subtly changed her position. I mean, you would have seen it, but her instinct was, if somebody had a go at her, she immediately punched back. She wouldn't concede anything. But she would think about it. Can I tell you a story about that? After she ceased to be Prime Minister and I'd retired and I went to my college doctorate, I invited her to come and speak. And she said, what shall I do? I said, well, if you'd confine yourself just to 10 minutes, because what the students will remember is the questions they ask you. And so she did, and she said, there's two things I want to tell you. One is that more casualties were lost through, in the last century, through wars. And she said, so you must always stand up for freedom and justice. And then she said, home, when I was growing up, 5% of children were born illegitimate. And now it's more than 30% and growing. What she meant was one-parent family. And when it came to questions, a young man said to her, Lady Thatcher, don't you think it's a little unfair to label a child illegitimate throughout its life when it's had no influence over the circumstances of its birth? And she said, well, what would you call them? I can think of another word, but you think that even worse. And so, anyway, the moment passed, and we had dinner. And as we were going home, as we were about to go home, we were having a whiskey in my lodgings, and we were talking about something completely different. And she suddenly said, you know, Robin, that young man who asked me about the word illegitimate, he had a point, didn't he? And I'll bet she never used the word illegitimate again.
Yeah, very good, very good. You were also Cabinet Secretary with John Major, and you were there when the IRA bomb hit the cabinet room as a result. But you say that John Major had a great influence on the Good Friday Agreement as it went along. Maybe he hasn't been recognised sufficiently for that. Can you give us an insight into what he did? I know he had a good relationship with Albert Reynolds. I know he said in the House of Commons, and I was there, that engagement with the IRA would turn his stomach whilst he was engaged in that. So it took quite a bit of bravery, that I would imagine, there.
It did. I think actually Tony Blair very generously recognised what John Major had done, laying the foundations for it with the Downing Street Declaration. But the moment that I remember was I was in the cabinet room and with John Major when somebody came in from the Northern Ireland office and said, we've had this message which was alleged to have come from McGuinness, saying the conflict is over and you must help us to bring it to an end. And so that immediately raised the issue whether and how the government should respond. And of course, I mean, it was absolutely cardinal at that point that the government didn't negotiate with the IRA, well, until they'd given up the armed struggle. And so they had to decide what to do that. And the cabinet was split. And some people said, this is a trap, don't respond. And John Major said, well, maybe it is a trap, but just suppose it isn't. And we can make progress and think of all the lives that we'll save. And so a response was prepared and was sent. And then there was the Warrington bomb, which brought everything to an end. But, that was a very brave thing to do. And, of course, it was a trap because I suppose that must have been February, March that the message, the conflict is over, came. And I think it was probably in September that the story, I imagine by the IRA, was leaked to the Times that the government had these exchanges. And Paddy Mayhew, who was the Northern Ireland Secretary, had to go and make a statement to the House. And to their great credit, the opposition parties said, we think you took the right decision, and they supported it. And so that did lead up to the Downing Street Declaration, and that was a first step towards a Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah. You were Cabinet Secretary and head of the Home Civil Service at the same time, and I think you've been asked if it's a good idea to separate them. During that time and other times of crisis, was it of assistance that you held both posts simultaneously?
Yes, I think it was of great assistance because, with the best will in the world, prime ministers who are very busy people, somebody who is just the head of the civil service, it doesn't get great access because, prime minister's got other things to do and manage the civil service. But the cabinet secretary does all the time. And so I think it was in the interests of the civil service that through being cabinet secretary, I could discuss civil service issues with the prime minister and had very good access. So yes, I think I think it's much better the two posts are combined.
Things have changed now, or purportedly changed with the civil service and the relationship with ministers, and we have SPADs coming in as well. What's your view on that? Because you've said that the civil service is a professional body, and irrespective of who's prime minister or cabinet secretary, the advice is the same, and the objectivity is paramount. So give us your historic reflection on that.
Well, I think that impartiality of the civil service is an essential part of our system. I think it's served Britain very well. But I think politics has changed.
It will.
And I mean, the way I sometimes put it, it's a bit of a soundbite, but I think today I get the impression that ministers have become more interested in politics and less interested in government. And of course, as a civil servant, I devoted my life to assisting politicians with government. Now, I am absolutely not against political advisors. During the time that I was a private secretary in Number 10, and while I was cabinet secretary, Harold Wilson had political advisors, Bernard Donahue and Joe Haynes, not as many as there are now, certainly, and Margaret Thatcher did. But we worked terribly harmoniously together. We all felt, I think, it was a tremendous privilege to be working in this office. And, Bernard Donahue has become one of my closest friends, Sarah Hogg from John Major's office, although she doesn't come to the House of Lords very much. And we felt like a family.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it greatly saddens me now to think that there is a sense of us and them between the political advisors and the civil servants. I regret it, and I think Number 10 has suffered from it. I think some of the things that have happened, like Partygate, I connect up with there being too many special advisors, and there are other causes as well. But I think that our government is the worse for it.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of governance, I think Tony Blair had an interview with the Observer very recently, and people were talking about reforming the civil service, and Blair, almost said, "Look, it's no use. You can't reform the civil service." He wasn't doing that in a condemnatory way, but he was saying, look, try and get on with politics. Forget the bureaucracy as the main issue. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I mean, actually, I think you have got to reform the civil service. Mm-hmm. You've got to reform it constantly.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the civil service has got to be kept up to the mark. And the civil service doesn't have the spur that private enterprise often has, the profit motive and all that. The civil service is doing things with other people's money, with taxpayers' money. It hasn't got a motive to be at the forefront of development. And so you've got to get them to do that. But you've got to lead the civil service, in my view, and not drive them. You've got to do a bit of driving as well. But, you know, I had, when John Major was Prime Minister, we had the Next Steps initiative.
Yeah.
And various programs of reform like that. Now, none of them is ever the end of the story. So you've got to keep at it. And but I think, as I say, leadership is the right thing.
And you're saying that leadership is walking alongside people rather than dragging them along.
I do.
Yeah.
I think that, and certainly not foul-mouthing them.
Yeah.
I take as my model Field Marshal Slim in Burma, you know, inheriting that terrible situation when the Japanese were advancing. He was a hard taskmaster, but he was a fair taskmaster, and people respected him.
Yeah.
And so I think that you get a better response from people in those circumstances than telling them they're rubbish.
What are the characteristics of a good minister in general with the civil service?
I think it helps if they've got clarity of mind, they know where they're going, and firm principles. And but also standing by, you know, standing on the course that they've set themselves. And so I think clarity and firmness, but also the willingness to listen. Mm-hmm. We talked a little earlier in this interview about Margaret Thatcher, who you didn't think you were making any impression on her, but actually she listened very carefully to what, and all the prime ministers I worked with did. Mm-hmm. So give your advisors a fair hearing, but then it's your role to decide, and then it's the role of the civil service, whether they think the right decision's been taken or not, as long as it's not an illegal decision or an immoral decision, then to try to implement it to the best of their ability.
The civil service has very intelligent people, but some would say that a lot of them are generalists, whereas you need some with skills and experience, and they would point to government projects that have gone awry, for example, in defence with procurement, and we know there's a litany, stuff like that. We've got HS2 as a result of that. We've got tax credits which went wrong. We could go on as a result of that. How do we change that?
Well, I think you've got to bring in the experts. And you've also got
But we've not been good at that to date.
No, we haven't always, I think. I think, you know, there's a long history
to
this.
Course. Yeah.
I mean, you're going right back to Northcote Trevelyan. It's an extraordinary thing to remember that when I was applying for the civil service, there were two forms of recruitment, method one, method two. Method one was an academic exam, you know. And so they did take generalists. I was a generalist. And, you know, I knew that I
There's no condemnation in generalists, but it's specific
I mean,
skills.
but there's a place for generalists.
Yeah.
You help the ministers with their speeches, their advice, answering their letters and so on. But when you've got a technical borderline, then you need specialists to do that. I had quite an admiration for what Dominic Cummings said. You know, I didn't approve of Dominic Cummings' methods, and I didn't like his style. But challenging the civil service and bringing in experts who can supplement the skills of the generalists is essential.
And trust in politics is, they say, at its lowest now, but there's always been an issue with politicians and trust, as we know that. How do you think that could be reversed in part in terms of trust? What should government do as a result of that?
Well, I think government should behave properly. Ministers should have high standards. Members of Parliament should have high standards. You know, the age of deference is gone, and that's a good thing. The other thing, of course, that would restore trust in politics, nobody would want it, a really good crisis restores trust in politics, because, you know, if...
that's the civil service at its best, isn't it?
It is, but it's also, it can be politicians at their best. You know, they give a lead. I mean, I remember when the Falklands were invaded, you know, that suddenly, and our troops went out there and, you know, they were in danger. Suddenly the whole tone of the media changed. And people cared terribly about not only what happened, but what the ministers said. Now, nobody wants a crisis, but if things are bad, then we depend on the politicians. And, you know, our history has been that they have lived up to what's expected of them.
There is a mood at the moment, I think, that the state's not working anywhere. And there was a book, I think, by Sam Friedman, Lawrence Friedman's son, on the issue of how we change that. Would you take such a gloomy view of that statement?
Well, I do take a bit of a gloomy view. I think that we are a country that has been very wealthy. Now, a lot of our staple industries have gone. We don't have the natural resources on which our economy was built in the past, but we're still trying to live like a country that is wealthy. We expect first-class public services. We perhaps, you know, indulge ourselves too much. I mean, there's too much regulation in the best interest, and, you know, one thinks of sort of health and safety, and which you get to a point where it's very difficult to afford that degree of interference with public services. You hear of doctors having an awful lot of paperwork, teachers having a lot of paperwork, so that some of these vital public service jobs are not fun anymore. And you have many GPs working 3 days a week, rather than the full week on that. There is a view still, and maybe I share it in part because I live in what you would call the periphery area in Scotland from here, and north of this is a different land as a result of that. And in relation to that, again, the view of Whitehall exceptionalism, and I think it would benefit the country if that notion could be dispelled. So how does government or civil service go about changing that relationship? Well, I should say I'm a Lancastrian. I've lived most of my life in the south, but actually my family is a Lancastrian family. And I believe, and I tried to practice it in the civil service, in delegation. I think that decisions are best taken closest to the people who are going to be affected by them. So I called it delegation. We tried to, we certainly delegated to departments. We set up agencies where people were responsible. I believe in devolution. I don't believe in independence for Scotland, but I do believe in devolution. So
you believe in devolution for the whole country, rather than just Scotland and Wales. And how do we go about that?
Well,
because
I think
we had a referendum in the northeast which failed during the Labour government.
I think the dilemma is that if you delegate a decision or if you devolve a decision and something goes wrong, then people say the central government has got to take it back. It's very difficult for central government to keep out when a local decision has gone wrong. It needs, strong mind, strong determination to do that.
And transparency and accountability.
And transparency and accountability. But, I think that, if I still had any influence on government, I would be urging them to take decisions as closely as possible to the people, but make sure that those people who are accountable. It's a very good example of this, really, is the community charge, the poll tax. With the best of intentions, Margaret Thatcher wanted to take that.
And you were there right at that time.
I was there.
And you were there when Michael Heseltine took over.
Exactly. And
destroyed it.
But the poll tax was misconceived. But what Margaret Thatcher wanted to do was to try to make sure that local politicians had to take the rap if there were high local taxes. But first of all, the actual community charge was misconceived, but also there was tremendous demand that it was got rid of, and the government, and so it all came back into central government, and I think doesn't work.
I was on the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards with Nigel Lawson, and we had a good number of social chats, and it was very good to work with. But he said to me at the time that he wasn't at the first meeting of the poll tax, and he was very much against it, but it had taken legs and he couldn't do anything about that. So how do you have a think again approach there?
Well, I remember that vividly, really. Nigel didn't make any pretense of his opposition to the poll tax. Margaret Thatcher, by this time, it was late on in her prime ministership, and she had lost the ability to argue, really. And actually, this would be a criticism of Nigel. He gave up. He said, well, if you're going to hell in a cart, you better go. And so, he didn't continue to argue and oppose it, as I think he should have done. It might not have been any use, because Margaret Thatcher was determined. But he saw the problems of the poll tax, and they turned out to be the thing, really, that contributed to bringing Margaret Thatcher down. It wasn't anything. And
I've read his autobiography when it's purported that he shadowed the Deutschmark without informing Mrs. Thatcher. Give us an insight into that.
Yeah. Well, Nigel Lawson was certainly a pretty sole operator. There is a long history of tensions growing between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They live next door to each other, and Margaret Thatcher always liked to remind people that she was the First Lord of the Treasury. Yeah. I think that was part of it. The same thing happened between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And it is very damaging for a government, because if those two leading ministers at the top of government aren't getting on well together and working in perfect harmony, then a house divided against itself in the end will fall.
You're intimate with the affairs of the Treasury. Is it the case then that the Treasury is too powerful and the Prime Minister's office itself is too weak?
Well, it's certainly the case that whoever controls the purse strings controls the world, really, and I think that's what leads, to a great extent, to the tension between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm not in favour, actually, of a very strong 10 Downing Street, or at least, because I don't think we should be like the Americans are, where you have a sort of White House, and the White House is more powerful than I think again, I think Margaret Thatcher had it more or less right. She was a very strong person. She held her Secretaries of State to account, but really the Secretaries of State have got to do it. It's a question of delegation. And so I don't think number 10 should try to do the department's job for them. And certainly when I worked there, I was very careful not to use my position of direct access to the Prime Minister to cry down what Secretaries of State and the departments were trying to do.
You came into the House of Lords in 1998, I believe, and you've been involved in quite a number of debates. I'd like you to give me your views in reform of the House of Lords and how far we should go on that.
Well, I have a view about the constitutional role of the House of Lords. And I think we've got a marvellous system if we would allow it to work, because we've got, on the one hand, the elected House, where people have got their constituency responsibilities, and these days, they're very much taken up by that, and they don't give as much attention to legislation as they do. And in the House of Lords, you've got people with experience and expertise who can contribute that and challenge the House of Commons. And if the two houses work constructively together, you get a very good result. There'll always be political differences, obviously, but I think that's what the House of Lords should try to do. Now, there are things about the House of Lords I think that certainly need reform. I was very much supported the conclusion of the Lord Speaker's Committee under Lord Burns that said that, in the end, this comes down to how many people you appoint. And he recommended that we should get down to 600. There should be 2 out for 1 in. And Theresa May operated with that.
She was very good on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but subsequent prime ministers haven't. In the end, the size of the House of Lords doesn't matter all that much, because actually the people who do all the work are actually only about half the...
Yeah, an average attendance 430 to 450
That's
a day.
right. And then, there are people who just attend when they've got something to contribute, and that's good. But it isn't good for the public image of the House of Lords. And I think some of the people who are appointed are only appointed because of patronage. And that brings the House of Lords into an element of...
So you could limit the Prime Minister's discretion here?
Yeah, well, I think that one does need to do that. And so I would see a limit on the flow of appointments into the House of Lords governed by legislation, which is the only way, I think, of controlling the Prime Minister. Now, I'm sorry to say, you may think this is a cynical view, it's very difficult to do that because neither party wants it. When they're in government, they want the power of patronage. Yeah. But I think it would be in the public interest to have legislation which constrained the Prime Minister's ability to appoint. And the point which Terry Burns made is a very good one, I think. If the Prime Minister has a limited number of appointments that he or she can make, he will make sure that these are appointments that are going to be valuable and who are going to do the work. And so that will be another advantage of constraining the Prime Minister's ability to appoint.
In your participation in the House of Lords, you have been articulate in terms of social issues, for example, gambling. You were very vociferous in that. But also you've chaired committees like the intelligence in Iraq as a result. Give me a flavour of your approach to those.
Well, I just think I've been extremely lucky in the jobs I've been given. I was put on the Select Committee on Gambling. I knew nothing whatever about gambling, really. But there were experts who were advising us, and then I became conscious that it was a big social problem. And so during the time I've been in the House of Lords, I think pretty well all the time I've been on one committee or another, the Committee of Inquiry into arms for Iraq, the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction, that was a one-off as a result of, and that was absolutely fascinating. I think I'm glad to say that the intelligence services cooperated because they were as embarrassed as anybody else. But the fact they'd said Iraq had got weapons of mass destruction, once we had access to the country, there weren't any, or we couldn't find them. So they cooperated with it. We did it in 5 months, which is unlike most committees. It helped in doing that by the fact that because it was intelligence, we took evidence in private. We didn't have any lawyers involved. And we were able to make recommendations which have made a real difference and I think are still being implemented. So I've had a lot of satisfaction from the things that I've been asked to do as a member of the House of Lords, and I've regarded it as a privilege.
Well, I've had a lot of satisfaction today chatting to you, Lord Butler, and getting your experience. So could I sum it up by saying that you're for change? You're for change in the House of Lords, you're for change in the civil service, you're for change in the relationships around the country. Devolution is important, but you've got to go about it in a very measured and intelligent way. Is that?
I think that sums it up very well. I'm for constant improvement. You will never reach the perfect state. The world changes, times change, attitudes change. You've got to be prepared to change with them. There was a civil servant who's I always remember, somebody was saying they were opposing a decision and said, if you do this, the world will never be the same again. And so my friend said, yes, he said, life does change. That's what distinguishes it from death.
Did Heraclitus not tell us that many, many centuries ago when he said change is the only reality?
Yeah.
And you know that as a classicist. Lord Butler, it was a pleasure to talk to you this morning, and I've gained a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will gain as well. So it's a privilege to speak to you and engage in conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Speaker.